Drozolowski then pulled his gun, pointed it at Ford. He said that Ford was undeterred, said, "You are pointing a gun at me. Are you going to shoot me?" Drozolowski said Ford was approaching him as he told him to stop. So you have your gun out, you're pointing it at someone, and they're advancing on you. What's a reasonable inference from that set of facts? They're clearly not afraid of your gun, right? They're going to close proximity, and once they're within arm's reach of that gun, it becomes their gun. Unless, of course, you're prepared to discharge the weapon at them. But if you're not prepared to shoot them, if shooting is off the table legally or because of your own decision-making, that becomes their gun. To my mind, it's no different than if that person is reaching for a gun on a table while you hold them at gunpoint. In fact, it's worse because they apparently believe they have nothing to fear from you holding that gun. So they can just take it from you because they don't believe you're going to shoot them, or they would not be doing this. They would not be advancing on you. And if they get the gun, it's worse than them reaching for a gun on a table because they're simultaneously disarming you while they're disarming yourself. If they're reaching for a gun on a table, they're arming themselves, but you still have your gun. It's quite different if they take yours. Now we get to some craziness by the defense, for sure, by the defender, the purported defender. Drozolowski said he kept the first two chambers empty for safety. So Professor Turley doesn't say, the news article didn't say, but obviously multiple chambers means that this is a revolver for all practical purposes. Semi-automatic pistols, handguns, semi-automatic handguns, they only have one chamber. And rounds are inserted in the chamber, fired, ejected from the chamber, but there's only ever the one chamber. Revolvers have a cylinder with multiple chambers in it, often 5, most commonly 6. It could be more depending on the gun, but there's a whole bunch of different chambers into which there's a cartridge. Normally, a cartridge would be loaded. Some exceptions for single-action pistols where it was historically common to leave the chamber under the hammer while you were carrying it unloaded because of the risk that the hammer could bump on something and discharge that round when you were not meaning to discharge the gun. But typically, modern day revolvers, you just load every chamber in the cylinder of the revolver. Drozolowski said he kept the first 2 chambers empty for safety. Why would you keep the first 2 empty? Again, if this was a single action revolver, I could understand keeping the one chamber sitting under the hammer empty, but 2? Why 2? He said that he pulled the trigger on the first empty chamber. Okay. This, I guess, was supposed to be a warning trigger press, a warning hammer drop. By the way, folks, if the chamber under the hammer in a single action revolver is the empty one, to fire the gun, even with a double action revolver, to fire the gun, the hammer has to cock. That rotates the cylinder to the next chamber. So the empty chamber under the hammer becomes irrelevant at that point. He said he pulled the trigger on the first empty chamber, but Ford continued to advance. He then pulled the trigger again, and it went off. And Drozolowski here is saying, well, I was surprised it went off because I keep the first 2 chambers empty. That was his plan. Keep the first 2 chambers empty so you could have 2 warning hammer drops. Why is that a bad idea, folks? Well, first of all, you may not have time. You may not have the luxury of 2 harmless hammer drops if you're actually facing an imminent deadly force threat, right? What if Ford had pulled out his own gun and now it's a gunfight and you have to fire twice before a round comes out of your gun? So you may not have that luxury. Second, and probably what happened here, is it's too easy to screw up. It's too easy to make a mistake. Maybe there were 2 empty chambers in this revolver. Maybe one of them was under the hammer. And then when the hammer was cocked for the first shot, that empty chamber goes away. The second empty chamber is now under the hammer when it falls. But then when you go to shoot again, the second empty chamber becomes irrelevant, and a chamber with a cartridge under it in it falls under the hammer, and you hear a bang when you were expecting a click. That may well be what happened here. So what Drozolowski is saying is he didn't actually intend to use deadly force. He thought this was going to be a click, not a bang. Is that a problem for the defender here? And I mean, Professor Turley doesn't speak to any of this. So we're not even at the portions of the blog post yet where I have disagreement's probably a strong word, but where I sense a lack of clarity in the legal explanations here. But yeah, this could be a huge problem for Drezalowski, because self-defense is inherently an intentional act. If you're using deadly force against another person and want to justify that as deadly force, you're shooting them with a bullet, and you want to justify that as self-defense, the shooting with the bullet has to be an intentional act, not an unintentional act. There's no unintentional self-defense. That's not a thing. The whole argument of self-defense is that you reasonably perceived an imminent threat of unlawful deadly force harm to yourself or another person, and you intentionally used deadly force to stop that unlawful deadly threat. If your use of force was not intentional, it was not self-defense. It was something else. What else could it be? Well, in theory, it could be accident, but accident, so there is a legal defense of accident, just like there's a legal defense of self-defense. If your conduct results in some harm that was entirely unpredictable, unforeseeable by you, that can legally simply be an accident, and an accident carries no legal liability. It's unforeseeable. So the illustration I commonly use is you have an elderly aunt and you go to her apartment and she asks you if you can move a dresser from one side of the room to the other, and you're happy to do that for your aunt. So you pick up this heavy dresser, you move it across the room, you put it on the floor, and unbeknownst to you, the floorboards, the beams under the floor are rotten, eaten by termites, and the dresser falls through the floor and kills another old lady in the apartment below. Did you kill that old lady? Your conduct did, for sure, right? She would not have died but for your moving the dresser, but you have legal liability for that. No, that's a genuine accident, completely unforeseeable by you. There was no way you could know that the dresser would fall through the floor. When you're trying to claim accident in the context of a firearm, the handling of a firearm, it just doesn't really work, because firearms are inherently dangerous instruments. We all know they're deadly if mishandled. Everybody does. So it's simply presumed that you're aware that mishandling of it will create an unjustified risk of death or serious bodily injury to others. So there's no real accident with firearms. I would argue there's no real negligence in the handling of firearms. That if you kill someone while handling a firearm, really the only way to do that is to violate the fundamental rules of gun safety, that becomes a reckless killing. And negligent killing would be cause for civil liability. The other party could sue you, or their survivors could sue you in civil court for a judgment for the loss of their loved one. Recklessness gets you into criminal court. That's a criminal state of mind. This is what happened with the Alec Baldwin shooting of Helena Hutchins. He was handling a gun, didn't follow the rules of gun safety, knew he was handling a real gun capable of killing people, never checked to make sure it was not loaded, pointed it at Helena Hutchins and killed her with it. That's reckless manslaughter every day of the week and twice on Sundays. Now, he managed to get his charges at least apparently dropped. They're dropped without prejudice, so they could, in theory, be brought back. But that was a political decision by the prosecutor, not a legal decision. The prosecutor in New Mexico has everything they need to prosecute and convict Alec Baldwin of reckless manslaughter if they wanted to do that. It's up to them, totally within their discretion. So this could well be reckless manslaughter here. He decided he was going to follow this 2 empty chambers plan, and he screwed it up, and he killed someone unintentionally. But if you're pointing a gun at another person, and especially if you're pulling the trigger, and you know there's some bullets in the gun, and you just mess up your 2-chamber policy, were you creating an unjustified risk of death or serious bodily injury to that other person? Knowingly. Yeah, you were. And if this is a reckless killing, reckless manslaughter, and I'd have to look to see he's charged with second-degree murder, which is an intentional killing. But if this is a reckless killing, that could well be a lesser included offense of second degree. I'd have to check. It's been a while since I looked that closely at Florida killing laws. You can raise the legal defense of self-defense to a second-degree murder charge, but not to reckless manslaughter, not to an unintentional killing. let me clarify that. I don't want to be unclear either. I accuse Professor Turley of being unclear. Now I feel like I might have muddied things up. You can raise self-defense as a legal defense to a charge of reckless manslaughter, but it works in a different way. So when you are charged with an intentional killing, you're not denying it was an intentional killing. You're saying, if you're claiming self-defense as a legal defense to an intentional killing, you're saying, yeah, you're not saying it wasn't me or it was an accident. It was unintentional. You're not saying any of that. You're saying, yeah, I shot that guy on purpose. I killed him, as a result of the gunshot that I fired on purpose. But I did it with the legal justification of self-defense. So you're conceding the elements of the criminal charge. You're not denying them. But you're saying you should be nevertheless excused from legal liability because you have the legal justification of self-defense. The self-defense becomes like an imputed negative element to the criminal charge. So even though you committed every element of the criminal charge, which would normally be enough for a conviction, you nevertheless are free of legal liability because of the justification of self-defense. When you're claiming self-defense to a charge of reckless manslaughter, it works differently. You're not conceding the elements of the criminal charge. One of those elements is recklessness, the knowing creation of an unjustified risk of death to another person and ignoring that risk. You're not conceding recklessness. What you're doing is you're saying it was not reckless because it was lawful self-defense. And this is a subtlety. It may be hard to grasp, but it's referred to as an element eliminating or negating traverse defense under the law. So self-defense to second-degree murder, you're saying, yep, I did everything. Every element of the criminal charge did it. But I'm still free of criminal liability because of my conduct falls within the definition of the justification of self-defense. Reckless manslaughter, you're saying, no, I don't concede the elements of reckless manslaughter because it was not reckless, because it was lawful self-defense. And lawful self-defense, one of the elements is reasonableness. If the jury believes it was lawful self-defense, then it was reasonable. And if it was reasonable, it was not reckless. Reckless is inherently unreasonable. But folks, please don't do this kind of thing. I'm going to leave a certain number of chambers empty. The first round of my shotgun is going to be rock salt, is going to be a beanbag round. So the first shot I fire will be non-lethal, and only if they get past the beanbag round or the rock salt will the shots be. People screw it up. You might screw it up. And you'll be firing what you think is a non-deadly round because the conditions for deadly defensive force have not yet been met, or you would have cycled that non-deadly round out to get to a deadly round. And you'll end up killing somebody under circumstances in which even you didn't believe that killing was legally justified. So I much prefer that. I definitely advocate that people have both deadly defensive force and non-deadly defensive force options on the table. But they should be, in my opinion, distinct tools. I had someone pitch to me the business idea of rounds for a real firearm, for a real handgun, but they'd fire like wax plugs. So the first couple of rounds in a semi-automatic pistol would fire, but it'd just be little wax plugs. They wouldn't be deadly force. Same problem is here. How do you know you're not going to screw it up? First of all, how do you know you're not going to need a bullet the first time you fire the gun? What happens if you screw it up? So I believe that deadly weapons should be left as deadly weapons. You should not be pulling stunts to make them operate in some kind of hypothetical non-deadly force manner. It's why I don't like the products in that company, Byrna, that produces a pistol that fires a pepper spray capsule. It looks just like a real gun. How easy to confuse with a real gun. How easy for observers, by the way. Here's another risk. So you have that shotgun with the beanbag round, or you have this guy's revolver that's supposed to have 2 empty chambers. And an observer, a third party, sees you pointing that gun under circumstances where deadly defensive force would not be warranted based on their reasonable perception of what's going on. Could they shoot you in defense of that other person you're threatening and have that be lawful? Sure. So don't conduct yourselves in ways in which these misperceptions can occur. And that happens not infrequently. folks. Often it's the police. They turn a corner, they encounter someone holding a gun under circumstances where there's been killing going on, and they shoot that person. And sometimes that person is just a bystander who just picked up the gun. So your defensive tools, in my view, should either be clearly, explicitly, and only deadly force defensive tools like a pistol, a shotgun, whatever you pick, but it's never used for non-deadly defensive purposes. And then your non-deadly defensive tools should be things that are not going to be perceived or used for deadly force purposes. Canisters of pepper spray, maybe a taser. I don't really recommend tasers, but tasers, tasers are designed so they don't feel like, well, they kind of do feel like a gun, don't they? We've seen that get confused, haven't we? Kim Potter, taser, taser, taser. And they sell those things in all black. Would you believe it? Kim Potter's wasn't all black, and she still confused it. All right. So please don't do this kind of two chambers empty thing. Ford was shot in front of his young son, the 8-year-old son. The most helpful evidence for Drezalowski, the shooter, may come from that child, Ford's 8-year-old son, the victim's 8-year-old son, who told police that his father, the victim, told Drezalowski, "I'll cut your head off with the chainsaw." Was he holding a chainsaw? Yes. Was he in sufficient proximity to bring that chainsaw to bear imminently? I'm presuming so, that he wasn't more than 20 or 30 feet away. Would a chainsaw be readily capable of inflicting death or serious bodily injury? Now, the article goes on here. Professor Turley reports that, however, he said that the chainsaw was not on or running at the time. Does that matter? Well, clearly, if the chainsaw is running and it could be brought to bear, it's going to inflict death or serious bodily injury, right? The definition of deadly force. But if it wasn't running, it's still what? What's a chainsaw weigh? 8 pounds, 10 pounds, metal object? If Ford was holding a bat and said, "I'm going to hit you in the head with this bat," the bat doesn't have a running chain. But would that still be deadly force? Just as a blunt impact weapon? The chainsaw could be used in that manner, and it does have a sharp blade on it, sharp chain on it. And they're sharp, folks. They're sharp. Even when they're not running, they're sharp. It's like, 60 or 70 or 80 little cutting blades all along the length of the chain. I don't think any of us would volunteer to be struck with a non-running chainsaw. We'd all be in reasonable fear of suffering, if not death, at least serious bodily injury, right? Especially if we were struck around the head, the neck. To my mind, it's like a large edged weapon, even if it's not running. But of course, this is the kind of argument that a prosecutor would make, right? Hey, it wasn't really a deadly weapon. It's not like it was running. If it was running, that would be different. By the way, how long does it take to start a chainsaw? Well, those of you who've worked chainsaws know that answer is extremely variable. Some chainsaws are pretty damn hard to start. Some of them never start. But a chainsaw that's just been running, and presumably that's the case here, generally not that hard to get started again. It's already warmed up. So not that quick. Pull the cord. And now you have something that can only be described as a deadly force weapon if it's used as a weapon.